there. It's a framework that is pretty, I mean, it's pretty progressive. It's a big departure from how we've paid for things in the past, and if it went into effect just as it is, that would be a very big change for providers in this country. So I think there's a lot more that is going to come up about that the next president will have to deal with.
I think, building on Rachel's, I think the cost issue is not going to go away. I think that's going to be like the next big thing. I also think, and maybe this is inside the Beltway, but I think the Planned Parenthood stuff is not going away, regardless of the information and misinformation that is out there and being spouted. I also think, and this is probably foolishly optimistic, but in light of recent events, gun control and maybe even a broader piece of discrimination. Somebody mentioned the Black Lives Matter stuff. I don't know. I mean, again, that's probably foolishly optimistic, but I think there's a very strong movement that people keep talking about discrimination and gun control and violence and how all these things tie together. And so I think that will at least be somewhere mentioned in addition to all the other pieces.
Yeah, I think gun control is going to be hard, but it does dovetail to mental health bills and substance abuse bills, and there's a couple out there that both the Senate and the House have been pushing for, so I think maybe you get it through that way, right? You use the gun control argument to an extent on the mental health. But also from an outside DC perspective to an extent, like Chad, as far as how I look at my clients and what they're paying attention to, whether the government shuts down and debt ceiling, that's just noise to an extent outside of DC for a lot of people. We assume that they'll figure it out in the last minute, however they do it. But what healthcare-wise, I think you could be facing, or Lydia or Adriana could be facing from the regulatory perspective, there's a lot of payment system reforms within Medicare. And Medicare impacts state Medicaid and workers' comp programs and commercial payers. You have some PT payment reforms, both on the physician fee schedule as well as the skilled nursing facility methodologies that are coming into play or being discussed. Hospice payment reforms as far as how long people are staying in hospices. Home health reform and how they pay for that. The DME competitive bidding program is essentially in a couple of months going to roll out nationally for a number of people with new pricing. All those things are going to impact constituencies, which ultimately feed back up to Congress and to these offices. So those are maybe a lot of the regulatory type things that are bubbling up.
Great, all good answers. So maybe we'll open it up and see if anyone has any questions, including the back row there. If anyone has any burning questions, and when you ask your question, either indicate who you'd like to answer, or whether everyone should answer your question. No one has any questions?
Nailed it. Oh.
I think everyone's open to answer this question. I think I'm intrigued by the outside DC perspective. So I'm in New York currently, and I love living in New York City. And I guess I'm wondering for the fellows who is still in DC, who hasn't been, in sort of your opinion on utilizing your network onward, in terms of doing health policy in other places, or you've got to be in DC. I think I've just always sort of been curious of where you feel like either the network that you've built is
Well, maybe we'll start with the folks that have been outside DC. John and Chad have both taken their fellowship and their connections. And
New York.
And New York, right. Okay, so we have 3 folks. We'll start with them.
The network has much broader tentacles than you might think it does. I was worried when I left here. But then you go and you interview and somebody says, well, you work for Savell. Like, how the heck do you know Savell? Like, everybody knows the people that you're going to be working with and for. You also find that Hill people manage to end up in high-level positions almost everywhere. So I have run into, I now work for somebody who I overlapped with that worked for Liz, who hired me a year ago. So
wait a minute, I hired her. I'm ahead of her on it. You talking about Andrea?
Yeah,
I hired her.
See, it goes back even further. So
Back to the Civil War.
I worried about it when I left. But doesn't matter where you want to go, New York, there are tons of opportunities. I was in Central Jersey for 6 years. I mean, and even found people there who were well connected to this network. So hasn't been an issue at all.
I joined a startup, a Silicon Valley startup, when I moved to San Francisco. And I worked there for 3 years before my wife's job brought us back to DC, but I live here now, but I'm still working for that company. And at the time, there were, I don't know, maybe 100 people who understood health reform as well as I did. I didn't realize that when I was starting looking for a job, but I worked in Congress and in the Obama administration. I was now going out to the private sector. The company I found hired me to do product marketing and didn't realize it, neither did I, but what I do most now is the policy work. And for 3 years out there, between my Politico Pro subscription and my contacts, I was able to provide us with insights that helped to drive our decisions to release new products that were exceedingly important. I'm not just saying that because it was my work. It just, healthcare, federal regulations really do shape markets and what companies can and can't do. And to be able to predict what's going to happen by reading the tea leaves, or maybe use a different metaphor, you become fluent in the language of DC when you work here. And if you can read what's coming in the news in the language that it's written and not through translation, you have a real advantage. And I found that was applicable in Silicon Valley. Chad is applicable in New York. I think Martin did the same thing. So it shouldn't, if you come here, if you're here for a few years, then you leave, it'll be like getting another great graduate degree in the language of Washington, and it's definitely applicable elsewhere.
Yeah, I'd agree. I do a healthcare policy every day. It's just for a different audience of who I'm doing it for, but I have to be very involved. My network is obviously much smaller relative to the people in DC than it used to be, but Winston Fellowship is a secret handshake, so it works out well, and you cross paths with a lot of people who know somebody who knows somebody. So it's out there, and I think, I've really tried to push over the last couple of years getting the fellows to come up to New York, and it hadn't been done for a long time. I know we didn't go to New York that very much, and most didn't, but between Chad there, Rachel has Commonwealth Fund there, myself, other people, I think they met with Karen Ignani at Emblem this year as well. There's a lot of great healthcare that's going on up there. It's an extension, and I also completely did not appreciate when I worked in the Hill the level of involvement from the finance and investment community, which is obviously centered in New York. They're in everything in healthcare that you can imagine. We cover every service area down to the smocks that are in the dentist office. I mean, our clients are that deep into things.
Wow. Anyone have anything to add who stayed in DC?
I mean, I stayed in DC, but I worked for an organization whose headquarters is in New York. I think what is important I think what's easy to forget when you're in DC is that it just seems like these are things that everybody knows, right? And everybody, we all, after you've been on the Hill or in the administration, it just seems like, oh, this is kind of common knowledge. I think those skills are even more important when you take them outside of DC, because now you're going to a situation where they don't understand how the process works. They don't know the right people to get on the phone. I mean, I've always said, and we say to the fellows every year, there's no possible way that you guys are going to know the answer to every kind of health policy question that crops up. But what do you need to know? You need to know who to get on the phone, and you need to understand what their bias could potentially be when they're talking to you. So, to be able to really trust the source of the information that you're getting. So to have those resources and go back to Colorado or Iowa or the Ozarks, wherever he came from, was always kind of, I think, the original vision, right, Susie, of the fellowship. It wasn't to populate and take over the administration, although that's kind of cool. Winston, unite, we just have our own Congress. I don't think that was ever the vision. It was, let's bring people, let's teach them, kind of how it's done, show them both the role of public-private actors, and then set them free. And for the most part, we've got a good, obviously the ones that are based, in Washington State and, Philly and other are less likely to be able to be here today. But they're everywhere. And so, I wouldn't be too worried. I don't think that coming and being a fellow is saying I want to be a health policy wonk for the rest of my life in DC necessarily.
We got people out on the West Coast, actually.
We do.
Christina Bethel.
Mhm. Diana?
Diana, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
As you said, the public-private is a huge thing. People don't get the connection public-private, and I will tell you what all, I'm sure you're wondering, well, how do you come up with the name Marwood Group, right? Where did that come from? Well, Marwood Group was started by Ted Kennedy Jr. and another guy from New York who was healthcare insurance and Republican. Why they come with Marwood? Because they thought there was a